What if the most loving thing someone could say to you was also the most terrifying thing you had ever heard?
That tension is exactly what Matthew 23 through 25 holds. And it is one of the most serious stretches of text in the entire gospel.
Welcome to Matthew, the King and His Kingdom, Portraits of Jesus, Part 2. I am Jon, and I am here with Lauren. This is Lesson 11, Pronouncements, the King's Woes, and we are working through Matthew 23 through 25 today.
The lesson aim is to understand the king's woes and warnings to Israel and to his followers. And if you have been with us through this series, you know we have been building toward exactly this moment for several weeks now.
Last time in Lesson 10, we watched the religious leaders lay trap after trap for Jesus in Jerusalem, and he walked through every single one of them without losing a step. The question we left with was a searching one. What am I allowing to close my ears to what Jesus is actually saying?
And that question becomes even more urgent now, because in these 3 chapters, Jesus stops deflecting the traps and starts issuing verdicts.
That is a real shift in the tone of Matthew, and it is worth naming before we get into the material. The confrontations in chapters 21 and 22 were public exchanges. Here in chapter 23, Jesus is still speaking to the crowds and to his disciples, but he is no longer in a back and forth with his opponents.
He is pronouncing, and the lesson author uses the phrase, the king's final extended pronouncements before his passion, which I think is a beautiful and weighty way to frame it.
The study guide opens with a picture I want to sit with for a moment. It says, there are a lot of trees in this section, meaning important details that could each deserve their own deep study, and if we try to examine every single tree, we will get lost in the forest.
So, the lesson intentionally takes a bird's eye view, and I think that is actually the right instinct here. Because the broad architecture of these 3 chapters tells a story that is more important than any single verse in isolation.
Let me sketch that architecture briefly. Chapter 23 is Jesus' most concentrated and severe confrontation with the Pharisees anywhere in the Gospels. 7 woes, and a climax that is both devastating and strangely hopeful. Then chapter 24 opens the Olivet Discourse, which is a private conversation with the disciples on the Mount of Olives, and it addresses the destruction of the temple and the coming of the Son of Man.
And then, chapter 25 gives us 3 of the most famous parables Jesus ever told: the 10 virgins, the talents, and the sheep and the goats. And each of those parables is doing specific theological work that connects back to everything the discourse has already said.
That is the forest. Now let us walk into it carefully. The first talk about it question is the natural starting point, and it asks, what is a woe? Summarize Jesus' woes in Matthew 23 and explain their significance and seriousness. How does this chapter end and lead to the next?
So, let us start with the basic vocabulary question. What is a woe? Because I think a lot of us hear that word in a churchy context and we sort of gloss over it.
A woe is a prophetic judgment. When a prophet speaks a woe, they are speaking for God in issuing condemnation. It carries the weight of a curse, not just a criticism.
Isaiah 5 is a classic Old Testament example, where you get a long series of woes pronounced over Israel for specific failures. And when Jesus does this in Matthew 23, he is standing in that same prophetic tradition.
But he is doing something even more structurally significant than that. Think about where we are in Matthew. Chapters 5 through 7 gave us the Sermon on the Mount, and it opens with the Beatitudes, 8 blessings. And the teacher's guide makes this observation that I find genuinely striking. Jesus' 7 or 8 woes in Matthew 23 are likely the direct inverse of those 7 or 8 Beatitudes.
So, the whole framing flips. In the Sermon on the Mount, blessed was the opening word, describing kingdom character. Here, Woe is the opening word, describing the failure and perversion of that character.
Blessed are the poor in spirit. Woe to those who put on the appearance of spiritual wealth while robbing widows. The contrast is not subtle.
Let me read the opening formula that Jesus repeats through this chapter, because the repetition itself is part of the point. Matthew 23:13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in.
That is the first woe, and it is devastating. These are the people who should be the gatekeepers of God's kingdom, opening the door wide, and instead they are shutting it in people's faces.
And notice the word that anchors every single one of these woes. Hypocrites. That word appears in the opening formula of each rebuke. Jesus is naming the root condition, not just the symptoms.
Hypocrisy means putting on a mask, performing religion, while the inside is something entirely different. And the lesson points out that spiritual blindness is paired with hypocrisy as the second repeated condition. Verses 16, 17, 19, 24, and 26 all return to this theme of blindness.
And those two conditions together, hypocrisy and spiritual blindness, are what make the situation so dangerous. Because a blind hypocrite cannot see that they are blind or that they are playing a role. They genuinely believe the performance is the reality.
Right. And Jesus traces that combination to increasingly serious outcomes. It starts with failing at religious leadership, moves through exploiting the vulnerable, and arrives at something genuinely dark. Verse 34, where Jesus says, "They will kill and crucify those God sends to them."
Let me read that. Matthew 23:34. Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city.
There is no way to read that verse without hearing the crucifixion in it. Jesus is not only pronouncing judgment on past behavior, he is forecasting his own death and the deaths of his messengers as the culminating expression of this same pattern of rejecting God's messengers.
The study guide says it plainly. Surely King Jesus sees his own destiny in this last woe. And that awareness makes the passage even more extraordinary. He is pronouncing these woes knowing full well that he is about to become their victim.
That is not the voice of someone who has lost control of the situation. That is the voice of a king who sees everything clearly and still chooses to walk into it.
Now, the seriousness of these woes is something we should not soften. Matthew 23:33 is one of the most severe statements Jesus makes anywhere in the Gospels. Let me read it. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell?
Hell is the word. Jesus does not use softer language here. He names the destination that awaits both these leaders and, verse 15 tells us, the converts they have made in their own image.
And then the chapter closes in a way that genuinely surprised me the first time I read it carefully. After all of that condemnation, verse 37 opens with mourning.
Let me read it. Matthew 23:37 through 39. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate, for I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
The condemnation is real, but the love is also real. Both at the same time. He wanted to gather them. He is the one who is being rejected, and he is the one who grieves the rejection.
And then notice the two things that end the chapter. A house left desolate. and a coming king who will one day be welcomed. Those are not random closing notes. Those are the two themes that Matthew 24 will immediately pick up.
The disciples are sitting there. They have heard all of this. And then they look at the temple. And Jesus says, it is all going to come down. That is the bridge directly into the Olivet Discourse.
Which brings us to question 2. What two questions inform Matthew 24? Summarize Jesus' answers and what he instructs his followers to be in response to these events.
So let us set the scene. Matthew 24, verse 3. The disciples have come to Jesus privately on the Mount of Olives. Let me read their question. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?
Two questions that are actually tangled together in ways that have kept Bible students debating for 2,000 years. When will the temple fall? And when will you return? And Jesus does not always clearly separate the answers.
The lesson is honest about this, and I appreciate that. It says, and I am paraphrasing, that some teachers try to put all of the fulfillment in the past at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and others put it all in the future. But the text itself seems to point in both directions at once.
And the teacher's guide does something wise here. It says, acknowledge the viewpoints, admit that the temple was destroyed exactly as Jesus predicted, and acknowledge that we still await the promise of his coming. These themes are tangled together, both in the text and in time, but we can discern a difference.
And rather than getting bogged down in the prophetic timeline debates, the guide pushes us toward a more urgent question. What does Jesus call his disciples to do? Because that is not disputed.
And the answer to that question is actually very clear. Do not be deceived. Do not be troubled. Endure. Preach the gospel. That is the core of Jesus' instruction to his people for the entire stretch between his departure and his return.
Let me read Matthew 24, 13 and 14, because this is what the lesson calls the key passage. But he who endures to the end shall be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come.
Those are marching orders, not a timeline, not a puzzle to solve. Endure, preach. Those two commands sit at the center of everything Jesus says in this chapter.
But the second half of Matthew 24 intensifies the theme even further. And this is where I think the passage becomes personally searching. Jesus spends a lot of time in verses 29 through 51 talking about the coming of the Son of Man, and then about watchfulness and faithfulness.
Let me read Matthew 24, 36 and 42. First verse, 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. And then, verse 42. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming.
The lesson's key text captures that same tension. Matthew 24, 42 through 44. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect.
And the teacher's guide makes a comment that I think is genuinely funny and genuinely sobering at the same time. It says, funny how we debate the timing when Jesus says plainly that no one knows it. What he insists on is not that we calculate correctly, but that we be found ready and faithful when it happens.
We spend so much energy trying to pin down the day, and Jesus explicitly says that is not knowable. What is knowable is what he wants us to be doing while we wait.
The faithful servant and the evil servant in verses 45 through 51 land this point hard. The faithful servant is found doing his master's work when the master returns. The evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming. and begins to abuse his fellow servants and live selfishly.
The evil servant's problem is not that he stopped believing his master would come. It is that the delay became permission to live as if accountability were indefinitely postponed.
That is such a precise diagnosis of a spiritual pathology that we can all recognize if we are honest about it.
And it sets up the three parables of Matthew 25 perfectly, which brings us to question 3. Summarize the message of each of the three parables in Matthew 25 and explain how each addresses the concerns outlined in Matthew 24:29 through 51.
So before we go through each parable, I want to name the structural insight the teacher's guide highlights here, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it.
Yes, please.
The three parables in Matthew 25 are not just a collection of good stories. Each one is doing specific work in response to a specific theme that the latter half of Matthew 24 raised. They are answers to questions the discourse has already asked.
And 2 of the 3 parables deal directly with delay. The bridegroom is delayed. The Lord travels to a far country. Jesus is not pretending his return will be immediate. He is telling us that there will be a long wait, and he is asking what kind of people we will be during that wait.
Let us take each one. The parable of the 10 virgins, Matthew 25, 1 through 13. 10 young women are waiting for a bridegroom to arrive for a wedding feast. All 10 have lamps. 5 have extra oil. 5 do not. The bridegroom is delayed. All 10 fall asleep. At midnight, the cry goes out that the bridegroom is coming.
Let me read Matthew 25:10 through 12. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he answered and said, "Assuredly, I say to you, I do not know you."
The door is shut. That is one of the sobering images the teacher's guide specifically highlights as a judgment element in each of these parables. A shut door, outer darkness, everlasting punishment. Each parable ends with a note of real and final judgment.
And the point of the 10 virgins is specifically about readiness and watchfulness, which is exactly what Matthew 24:36 through 44 was talking about. The lamp oil is not something you can borrow at the last minute. It represents something internal and cultivated over time.
The practical question the parable is asking is, have you been keeping your lamp burning while you wait? Not just initially lit, but sustained, tended, maintained through a long and uncertain interval.
Then, the parable of the talents, Matthew 25:14 through 30. A man about to travel to a far country gives his servants different amounts of money based on their abilities. One receives 5 talents, one receives 2, one receives 1. He then departs.
Let me read Matthew 25:19 through 21. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them, and so he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, "Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I have gained 5 more talents besides them." His Lord said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord."
After a long time. That phrase is doing the same work as the bridegroom's delay in the previous parable. The Lord is gone for an extended period, and the question is what the servants do with what they have been given in the meantime.
2 of them invest and multiply what they received. 1 of them buries his talent out of fear, and when the Lord returns, the response is devastating. Matthew 25:28 through 30. Therefore take the talent from him, and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Outer darkness is the second judgment image the guide points to. And this parable is specifically responding to the theme of the faithful servant versus the evil servant in Matthew 24:45 through 51. Not just waiting, but working. Not just watching, but being profitable with what the King has entrusted to you.
The gifts are different for each person. 5, 2, 1. The master distributes according to ability, but the expectation is the same for all of them. Be faithful with what you have been given.
And the servant who buries his talent does not lose it through carelessness. He deliberately hides it. His explanation is that he was afraid. Fear of failure becomes the very thing that produces failure.
Then the third parable, the sheep and the goats, is in a different category from the first two. It is not a parable about the interval between departure and return. It is a parable about the judgment itself, the moment of the king's arrival and the settling of accounts.
Let me read Matthew 25:31 through 33. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left.
And notice something significant here. The word king appears in verse 34 and again in verse 40. Jesus is explicitly identified as king in this parable. The teacher's guide points to Matthew 23:8, which refers to Christ, the anointed one, the king. And now in the parable of the sheep and the goats, the same figure is sitting on the throne of his glory, pronouncing final blessing and final curse.
The woes of Matthew 23 are being enacted in Matthew 25. That is a structural arc across 3 chapters that I do not think we can miss.
And the basis of the judgment is stunning and worth sitting with. What does the king emphasize as the criterion for blessing or curse? Not doctrinal precision, not religious performance. Listen to Matthew 25:40. And the king will answer and say to them, Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me.
The hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, the prisoner. The king identifies himself with the most vulnerable and marginalized people in the world, and the question at judgment is, how did you treat them?
And then verse 45 is the mirror image. Assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me.
The third judgment image the guide names is everlasting punishment in verse 46, which closes the entire discourse. The king who blessed also curses. That is not incidental. It is essential to who he is.
So the 3 parables together form a complete answer to the concerns of Matthew 24:29 through 51. The 10 virgins address the readiness question. The talents address the faithfulness question. The sheep and goats address the coming of the Son of Man and the judgment itself.
They build on each other, and together they say, be ready when he comes. Be faithful while you wait, and let that waiting express itself in love for the least.
Which brings us to question 4, and I think this is the most integrating question in the whole lesson. How does Matthew 23 through 25 reveal Jesus as King? And how do his woes and warnings impact your faith today and point toward the coming kingdom?
This is the question that ties everything together, and I want to take it seriously rather than give a quick answer. Because I think a lot of us carry a version of Jesus that is very warm and gracious and accessible, which he is, but that does not have room for what we see in these chapters.
And that is important and challenging, because we cannot speak of a gracious king without also acknowledging his power to condemn and punish. We have to ask whether the Jesus of Matthew 23 through 25, sovereign, judging, issuing woes and curses, has any place in our day-to-day living or even our understanding of who he is.
The kingly authority of Jesus in these chapters is most clearly on display in exactly this: his exercise of just judgment. He sees through the performance, he names the root condition. He pronounces the verdict with complete authority. No one questions his right to say these things because the truth of what he says is self-evident to anyone paying attention.
And there is something in that which should cause reverence, not just warm affection. Reverence. The kind you feel in the presence of someone who sees everything truly and speaks accordingly.
I keep coming back to the lament over Jerusalem in Matthew 23:37, because that verse does something really important for our picture of this king. He is not pronouncing condemnation from a position of detachment. He is pronouncing it while weeping.
The judgment is real. The grief is also real. Both are expressions of the same love that wanted to gather Jerusalem like a hen gathers her chicks. The woe is what love sounds like when love has been rejected long enough and clearly enough.
And for us, the followers of this king, the warning is personal, because the disciples who heard the Olivet Discourse were not exempt from the possibility of becoming like the evil servant, or like the 5 foolish virgins, or like the goats who passed by the least of these without seeing the king in their faces.
The lesson points out that Matthew 24 speaks as much to us today as it did to the disciples then. Wars, famines, false prophets, tribulation, these have been constant realities in every generation since Jesus spoke these words. The instruction has not expired.
Do not be deceived. Do not be troubled. Endure. Preach the gospel. Those are not first-century instructions waiting for a future fulfillment. They are the standing orders of the King for his people in every age.
And I think what Matthew 23 through 25 does for our faith, if we let it, is give us a clearer picture of what the kingdom actually is. It is not just comfort and healing and belonging, though it is those things. It is also truth-telling that does not flinch. It is accountability that is real. It is a king who will come and will separate, and the basis of that separation will not be a surprise to anyone who has read these chapters carefully.
The study guide ends with a line that I want to just let land. This Jesus is what the kingdom truly is. We cannot avoid it as we share the gospel with all nations until the end comes.
If the gospel we are sharing does not include a king who judges justly, who calls people to readiness and faithfulness, who identifies himself with the least and most vulnerable, then we are sharing something smaller than what Matthew gives us.
And that is a searching question for how we live and how we talk about Jesus in our everyday context.
Let us move into the closing reflection. The Reflect on It section says this, and I want to read it because it captures the tone of this whole lesson really well. Matthew 23 through 25 is as sobering today as it must have been for the disciples hearing the message from Jesus' own mouth. Few New Testament texts show Jesus in his sovereign authority and judgment as powerfully as this one. It is a cause for reverence and for worship before the King, so be watchful and be faithful. Be ready. The King comes.
I have been sitting with the 10 virgins parable more than the others this week. Specifically, the detail that all 10 of them fell asleep when the bridegroom was delayed. All of them. Not just the foolish 5. And somehow, the 5 who were ready despite having fallen asleep.
The oil was in the lamps before they slept. The preparation happened earlier. That is the point.
Right. And it asks me, what is the oil in my life? What is the preparation that happens in the ordinary days so that when the extraordinary moment comes, I am not scrambling to borrow something I should have already cultivated?
For me, the sheep and goats parable is the one that keeps returning. Specifically, the surprise of both groups. The sheep did not know they had been serving the king. The goats did not know they had been ignoring the king. Both were surprised by what they had been doing all along.
which means the judgment reveals character that was already formed, not a performance put on at the last moment.
And that is actually a hopeful reframe of what the judgment is. It is not an arbitrary test. It is a revelation of who we have already become through thousands of small choices about how we see and treat other people.
So the question the lesson leaves us with is genuinely worth sitting with and not answering too quickly. What is being revealed about who I am becoming right now in how I treat the hungry, the stranger, the prisoner, the least? Am I keeping my lamp burning? Am I investing what I have been given or burying it in fear?
Those questions deserve more than a quick mental yes. Bring them into your prayer this week. Let the King who sees everything clearly be the one who answers them with you.
Before we close, I want to name where we are in the arc of this quarter, because we are getting close to the end and I do not want to rush past it. We started with the king entering history through David's line and God's covenant. We watched him be announced, baptized, tested, and begin calling people to the kingdom. We heard the Sermon on the Mount. We saw his authority displayed over sickness and death. We followed his disciples into their mission. We watched opposition harden. We sat with the parables. We traced the disciples growing slowly into understanding who he is.
And now we have arrived at the last major discourse before the Passion. The woes have been pronounced. The warnings have been given. The King has told his people what to expect and how to live while they wait.
Next week, we move into Matthew 26 and 27. Lesson 12, Passion, the King's Sacrifice. The public teaching is finished. What remains is the cup he said he would drink.
If you're reading through the quarterly this week, read Matthew 23 through 25 slowly. Let the woes land. Let the parables do their work. Notice what kind of king is speaking in these chapters, and let that shape how you think about the gospel you carry.
And read Matthew 25:31 through 46 again on its own this week. Let the question of the least of these become a genuinely searching one for your daily life. Where is the King showing up in the people around you?
Thank you so much for studying with us. These chapters are demanding and they are beautiful, and we are grateful to work through them alongside you.
We will see you next time for Lesson 12. Until then, be watchful, be faithful, and keep your lamps burning.
Thanks for listening.